And I'm glad I have Mea Culpa powered up all the way because it is time to make our way to the toughest area in the game, Mourning in Havoc. This area was added as part of the Wounds of Eventide DLC and it lives up to its name. Mourning in Havoc is an area made up of shipwrecks set in mud. This area to me also reads as a place frozen in time, as instead of a watery graveyard, the broken ships are held fast by the mud and mire in the background that mimics waves in its form. Andalusia is located in the south of the Iberian Peninsula, with the ports of Seville and Cadiz being some of the most historically significant for trade between the Americas and India, and the waters are home to countless shipwrecks. Within the fiction of Blasphemous, Mourning in Havoc is a cursed place that became the burial ground for any vessel that tried to pass through it. The same threatens to be done to Penitente, as the enemies of this area are pretty tough. We see here this anchor-wielding enemy who is kind of an advanced form of the Flaris Bull that wields an anchor instead of a spear. Not only are they much tankier than the Bull, but the anchor makes them much more of a threat vertically, which integrates well with the vertical level design of Mourning in Havoc. I kind of hated these enemies at first, seeing them as being way too durable and a bit of a nuisance to fight. However, I've grown to appreciate what they seem to be testing, which is if you understand interrupting and stunning enemies in Blasphemous to open them up for executions. This mechanic was refined after release, with charged and lunge attacks getting overhauled in the Stir of Dawn update to stun some enemies when timed correctly. This expanded system allowed for more tactical decisions and aggressive gameplay for players who could time these attacks appropriately. These enemies feel like a further iteration on this concept, where the stakes are higher as you navigate small platforms and environmental hazards to dispatch these squirrely and hard-hitting enemies. In this room we get the prayer bead Light of the Lady of the Lamp. This bead raises all defenses when out of flask by about 20%. The lore for this bead tells of a shipwreck where sailors, slowly dying of exposure upon the wrecked planks of the ship, were saved by a mysterious man in a boat with a lamp. This next enemy is a particular thorn in my side, and unlike the roly-poly anchor man, this boat figurehead enemy has not really grown on me over time. Typical for Mourning in Havoc, this enemy has lots of health and hits like a truck. This enemy also prevents you from moving forward, making it difficult to rush through this area. It isn't terribly difficult to dodge her electric orbs, but it really drags the pace of the fight down. My strategy ends up being to use Debla of the Lights, abusing the iframes of the prayer to not take damage from her orbs. While this is effective, it isn't really very fun, and I can't imagine the challenge of this enemy is to test if players know how to abuse prayer iframes. We also see these fodder enemies that pop out of their helmets on the ground and chase you. Their role seems to primarily be complicating the platforming, not only by getting in the way of those carelessly rushing forward, but as additional tension to navigating the electricity of this area, as they can't be truly killed, but only sent packing back to their Morian helmet for a limited time. At the time of development for Mourning in Havoc, Blasphemous 2 was already underway. Blasphemous 2 has a larger focus on Andalusia's connection with the ocean, and I would not be surprised to learn that Blasphemous 2's exploration into Cadiz and the Andalusian coast helped inspire Mourning in Havoc. The other factor, as we will soon see, is that the Game Kitchen began exploring further folklore in Seville for Blasphemous 2, and this area has a strong connection to a particular street in Seville. This area has always felt a bit different to me than other areas in Blasphemous, not only due to its difficulty in making my way through it, but also in that this area is less religiously focused than most other areas in Blasphemous 1. This is something that is more prevalent in Blasphemous 2, which begins to broaden the cultural inspirations of Andalusia beyond those related to its unique religious history, and I think you can see the beginnings of that shift here. Part of the challenge of this area is the sheer length of time you go before reaching a pre-do, making it a bit of a marathon where the focus ends up being on carefully navigating the omnipresent environmental hazards and formidable enemies. But the scale of it just makes it a bit tedious, and the fact that I've edited decent portions out of this area because it's just more of the same speaks to a lack of variety that encourages me to get through it more quickly, which I am then swiftly punished for because the level scale and density of hazards and enemies reinforces careful navigation. This final room before the boss is no exception, comprised of myriad electrical hazards and platforms made of broken ship masts, with more of the same enemies liberally spread throughout. I don't want to misconstrue that there's no joy in this area, I just think that compared to other areas there's not enough variety in what you're doing, and the scale and difficulty of it exacerbate this. I think this is why the common consensus online is not massively positive about this area, with the general comment being that it is too difficult. I do think it successfully repels players who are not in the endgame from foolishly pushing forward. But even with Penitente with endgame health and beads, this area is quite punishing and just doesn't make things interesting enough to justify the level of difficulty presented. In Spain, religious iconography was a particularly common theme for ship figureheads depicting saints or members of the Holy Family to grant their ships protection. In the fiction, I believe these ships are being used to depict the Lady of the Lamp, who is supposed to grant protection to sailors. While she may not have saved their ships, she's kind of living up to her name, protecting Penitente from progressing and slicing up more of her Morion-wearing buddies. We have reached the end of our journey through Mourning and Havoc by unlocking this shortcut, leaving only the boss left for us to conquer in this area. Contemplating whether to top off my health or give the boss a shot, I decide that I'd rather take a crack at the boss than navigate any more electrical hazards. To offset my diminished flasks, I decide to equip Tiento and see if the prayer will be enough to carry me through. Let's see how I fare against the legendary Sierpes. I love the introduction of this fight with the collage of shipwrecks in the background and the flashes of lightning that find Penitente ensnared by this beast. I like how the massive scale of Sierpes is implied here, as you can see it in both the background wrapped around the massive shipwrecks as well as in the foreground both below and beside you. Sierpes possesses the left eye of the traitor, which is ironically Sierpes' right eye, which was cast into the sea after being removed from the fourth visage. It is implied through the item description that Sierpes became the monster it is because of the eye, as it is only after the eye was cast into the sea that this place became a burial ground for any vessels that dared trespass. And in fact, it may even be that the eye is luring ships to this location, as it is said to beckon men and storms. And it seems that with Sierpes calling forth lightning with his tongue, that the great beast may pull vessels in by conjuring a storm and then finishing off the doomed ships by crushing them with its massive body. While Sierpes is based on Spanish folklore about a snake, the story takes place not in the depths of the sea, but in the sewers beneath Seville. In the late 15th century, children from the neighborhood around Swordsmith Street began to vanish. This went on for months without any suspects or leads, to the dismay of Alfonso Cardenas, the mayor of Seville. One day, Cardenas was informed that there was a prisoner who could solve the mystery and identify the culprit, but only if doing so would grant him his freedom, to which Cardenas agreed. The man was Argueso Melchor de Quintana, who was in jail for taking part in a rebellion against the king. Quintana recounted how he had attempted to escape the prison by tunneling into the sewers from his cell, but upon making his way into the sewers came upon a massive snake surrounded by the bones of children. Quintana stabbed the snake and returned to his cell, seeing an opportunity to leave jail legally and clear his name. The police found the giant snake dead, surrounded and filled with the bones of children as Quintana had claimed. The slain snake was presented to the public, and Swordsmith Street was renamed Serpent Street or Calle de la Sierpe, and bears that name to this day, and was the inspiration for this boss. The prisoner Quintana was granted his freedom as promised, and he ended up marrying the daughter of Mayor Cardenas. Between this and the giant pig in the sewers of London that inspired the giant pig in Bloodborne, we've got a whole monsterverse going on beneath medieval European cities. Sierpes is considered the best boss in Blasphemous by many, and while I don't agree, I think it's a really solid fight. The fight centers around striking Sierpes' tongue, which looks like a group of fused and fleshy skeletons, while avoiding a handful of lightning-based attacks, charges, and bony pokes from the snake. Sierpes has a lot of health and hits pretty hard, so while the fight isn't difficult to learn, dealing damage quickly while minimizing Penitente's damage taken is the key to the fight. I'm not particularly a fan of bloated health bars in games, and I think the focus of the fight on DPS while making few mistakes is not as interesting of an avenue of challenge for me as it might be for others. To mitigate this, I am attempting to maximize damage opportunities by using Tiento to make me invulnerable for a short time, allowing me to continually attack without worrying about dodging its attack and interrupting my damage output. Alternatively, I sometimes use Sagaria to your eyes like stars to increase my attack speed and deal damage faster. I like how the fight progresses with Sierpes beginning to switch sides at the halfway point, its attacks becoming more complicated and harder to avoid. That way the player can build off of their understanding of the fight as they figure out how to manage the various attacks according to their strategy. I can see someone argue that this relatively tame progression makes the fight less dynamic and adds to the feeling of longevity, but I think the root cause of my pacing issues are the bloated health bar, and would welcome the fight as it progresses, but with 25% less health. Eventually, after a bit too long for my taste, Sierpes is defeated, And I have to say, what a finish to the fight. I love the drama and bombast that caps off this fight, with Penitente being swallowed by Sierpes as the storm picks up, yet emerging victoriously through the eye. In a game of brutal executions, this is a very fitting and satisfying end to the battle. We also get the Echo and Shadow skin for beating Sierpes, which I think has a very nice color palette. You end up getting 5k tears of atonement for this fight, which seems surprisingly low for an endgame fight, but it doesn't really matter too much at this point anyways, especially with another upcoming boss fight that will secure that bag for us for the rest of the game. Before collecting the right eye of the fourth visage, I take a quick stop at Nacimiento, where I will upgrade my flasks again before the fight with Isidora. There is no progression in his story at this time until we give him all of the Quicksilver to upgrade the bioflasks, but they are getting noticeably fancy. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave Nacimiento in what looks like a really uncomfortable situation for now. I give the Ossuary a few more bones, with only one more set needed to complete the collection. And by the way, my reward for bringing these bones back is more than what I got for beating Sierpes. What a cheap snake. But now it is time to fight the next Wounds of Eventide DLC boss, Isidora, Voice of the Dead, who became available to fight after turning in 30 bones to the collector of the Ossuary. As I said before, I think having this reward for collecting 30 sets of bones makes the whole process feel more worthwhile, and gave the Ossuary a sense of greater purpose within the context of the game. Speaking to this corpse within the room will warn us about interrupting the song of Isidora, who lets none interrupt her song. And this is a good warning because Isidora is one of the toughest fights in the game and among my personal favorite boss fights in Blasphemous. Isidora was a beloved performer in Albero. One night, for reasons unknown, Isidora was seen heading toward the crypt beneath the old church in Albero wearing her stage outfit. Before the entrance to the crypt, she began to sing verses that no one living had ever heard before, and before long, voices from within the crypt could be heard singing back, forming a mournful duet with Isidora. She entered the crypt, closing the door behind her. More and more voices could be heard singing with her as she walked further into the crypt, and the voices drifted away as hers as they all faded into the distance. She was never seen again and has been since remembered as Isidora, Voice of the Dead. When the fourth visage was condemned, Isidora was charged with guarding the right eye of the traitor, which adorns the scythe that she wields. The blue and gold colors of Isidora's outfit evokes depictions of the Virgin Mary in Catholic iconography, and she is adorned with a halo similar to depictions of Mary and other important religious figures. She has the distinction of being the only boss in Blasphemous where you cannot pause the game or access the game menus, with attempts to do so being met by a message that says, "The Song of the Dead cannot be stopped." She is a tough fight. Her attacks consist of a number of different melee attacks using her scythe, as well as summoning fireballs and cyclones of fire. The most challenging aspect of her melee attacks are the charges. Both the spinning splash as well as the zip across the screen are the speed at which they are deployed. What I think makes Isidora both a tough fight and a fun fight are how she intermixes these melee attacks with her fiery area denial attacks. The fireballs in particular pollute the screen in such a way that managing Penitente's placement against theirs and Isidora's adds a critical mass of complication that makes the fight challenging and somewhat unpredictable. The columns of fire that accent the ends of the attacks serve a similar function in that they punish the player for poor placement at the end of some of her attacks. The columns of fire in which Isidora is gone act as both a momentary respite for healing, as well as a pacing device, taking you from the chaos of dodging fireballs and scythe swings to managing the predictable, punishing rhythm of the columns of fire. While I do think this gives some appreciated downtime to the fight, I will say that a small complaint I have about the fight is the amount of time in which Isidora is not present in the arena during the fight. While it has its place, it also draws out the length of the fight, and she already has a robust health pool, and I think that makes the entire fair just a bit too long. I am using the drop of coagulated ink to buff Debla of the Lights, which I deploy anytime Isidora goes into her rising animation as she summons fireballs. Below 50% health, Isidora goes into phase 2 where she summons more advanced and fiery version of her phase 1 attacks, while also pulling out a new move that summons a ton of fireballs. I like this progression as it takes what I think is the interesting part about the fight. It just ups the chaos and punishment for not managing your position in the arena well. Isidora is also floating in the air more, which does make Penitente's pace of dealing damage more limited, but rewards players who use some of the strategies mentioned above, but remember to use air impulse attacks to deal more damage to Isidora while she's in the air. I focus on employing air impulse attacks to build up my fervor meter, to use Dead Above the Lights not only to deal damage, but to provide a few iframes during particularly chaotic moments in Phase 2. Admittedly, I lose some or maybe most of my composure during the final moments of this fight, as my tactic devolves into a DPS race, but I manage Penitente well enough to pull out a victory anyways, defeating Isidora, Voice of the Dead. This nets me 10 whole tiers of atonement. Note that's not 10k, just 10. To be fair, the more important rewards are the striking blue and gold Chantress of the Dead skin and the severed right eye of the traitor, but Sierpes dropped similar rewards in more tiers. I guess the dead are just cheap. And speaking of the dead, let's wrap up the Ossuary for good. Returning the final set of bones to the Warden gets us the black and gold Warden of the Ossuary skin. I think it's smart to make the final reward a skin, as it is a permanent reward and isn't punishing players for not completing this collection on subsequent playthroughs, only really needing to get at least 30 to fight Isidora. So ends the task of the Warden, who tells us he will now be watched over by the bones as the ash covers him completely. And the next time we see him, he is unresponsive and covered in ash. Good night, sweet prince. With both eyes of the traitor collected, it is time to head back to the Knot of the Three Words and return the severed eyes to the fourth Guardian Visage and get a big old lore dump. With both eyes returned, the fourth Guardian Visage can finally share their secret with us. The fourth Visage explains that, in the most fervent and devout hearts lives the seed that lulls consciousness and controls the will, invisible chains from the high wheels that veil their hearts in unwavering faith. From my perspective, this is basically a fantastical representation of the blind faith that can be cultivated by fanaticism and dogma and override someone's ability to have greater perspective and reasoning on their own. Getting back to the lore dump, the fourth Visage have in their possession the true heart of Mea Culpa called the Apodictic Heart of Mea Culpa, which will enable Penitente to awaken the true guilt of the blade and pierce the heart shrouded by the miracle's veil. Apodictic, for those like me who were not previously familiar, is an adjective that describes something as expressing an absolute truth. To digest this new information, let's recap the story of the fourth Visage. In life, they were one of the four who witnessed the first miracle and were one of the greatest devotees to the Father. During the first miracle, they were the only one of the four who saw the high wills in their true nature. When the fervor of the four, who became the uncorrupted saints, were used by the high wills to create the Guardian Visages, the fourth Guardian Visage was rejected by the other three and deemed a traitor, saying that what they saw was not true and that they were being deceitful. And so the three Guardian Visages ripped the eyes out of the traitor's face and imprisoned the traitor beneath the tree in the Knot of the Three Words, where Penitente found them. Upon returning their eyes, we learn that the fourth Visage is protecting the true heart of the Mea Culpa, and in fact hijacked it before the birth of the sword in order to keep it safe. With the true heart, Mea Culpa will be able to cut the invisible chains that veil the heart of those with unwavering faith. What this is all saying to me right now is that the High Wills have a secret about their true nature they don't want getting out, and they've taken measures to ensure the blind faith of their congregation. The fourth Visage goes on to tell Penitente that they don't want just anyone's chains severed, but specifically those of the most righteous and unwavering person in Custodia, Crisanta of the Rapt Agony, captain of His Holiness Escribar's personal military force, the Anointed Legion. They want the veil lifted from her heart for her to see the truth that has been obscured, to wound her very soul. And this is where Crisanta really starts to come into her own in the story for me, and the High Wills really find their place thematically. Penitente and the Miracle are by design anonymous and mysterious figures. The Miracle is, by its nature, an unknowable divinity and cosmic horror. Penitente is more of an avatar embodying change and guilt than a defined person. With the Wounds of Eventide DLC though, Crisanta and the High Wills are brought forward and fleshed out more as characters in a way that helps the narrative land harder as we get into the true ending. And so as we move into the game endings, I have designed this playthrough so that I can present all of the endings in the sequence you'd naturally get them, which for most people is ending B followed by ending A, while bringing in the New Game Plus and additional story content at the appropriate time to discuss how it relates to the main story, and then ultimately concluding with the true ending and seeing how it masterfully brings everything together, even if I have some bones to pick with the final boss. Let's go confront Crisanta of the Rapt Agony. As a side note, I got the final relic off screen in the incorrupt hand of the Fraternal Master. When equipped, this relic faintly chimes a bell when Penitente is near a secret like an illusory wall. To get use out of this relic, I need to make sure it's equipped just in case, and I'm not going to do that. What I am going to do, however, is have Crisanta help me unlock everything I haven't yet unlocked, while also helping me prepare for ending A. I'm also going to make sure I have Tiento to my Thorned Hair equipped because it will be very useful against Crisanta. In order to prepare for the second ending A, I'm equipping the Immaculate Bead. I will need to die against Crisanta a few times to transform this bead into the Weight of True Guilt, which is required for ending A. Those who have fought True Crisanta might know why I'd like to take a few deaths from her in particular, and I will demonstrate why and explain shortly for those who haven't. Oh hey, remember this place? It's been a minute since we were focused on collecting the 3 masks of the Archdeacons for this elevator, but now it is time to complete that quest and reach the top of the Arch-Cathedral. I hand over the mirrored mask of Dolphos that we picked up in the convent to unlock the final level for the elevator, the path that leads to the man most responsible for the current state of Custodia, His Holiness Escribar. This is such a striking setting for what is arguably the climactic fight of the game, with the perspective of the buildings below giving this feeling of the city being jumbled and piled up below, and taking up both the ground plane and the sky plane of the background. And now it's time to finally confront Crisanta of the Wrapped Agony. As previously discussed, she's the captain of Escribar's anointed legion, and her blade is wrapped in the crimson bandages of the legion that are covered in oils blessed by Escribar. It's revealed in the art book that this is because her blade is affected by the miracle. She's also a penitent, as designated by her helm, and her penitence is blindness. To represent this, she has hands modeled into her penitential helm that cover her eyes. Crisanta and the Anointed Legion were charged with eradicating the Silent Brotherhood by Escribar, who labeled them heretics. The Anointed Legion carried out this order, the aftermath being the gruesome scene present at the beginning of the game, and it was Crisanta herself who killed Penitente just after attaining Mea Culpa, as shown in the kneeling comic. She told him that if he was truly blessed by the miracle, that he would be revived and they would meet again. And here they are. Crisanta now stands between Penitente and Escribar, intending to end his pilgrimage once and for all. Akin to Isidora, Crisanta's armor was inspired in part by depictions of the Virgin Mary. Her armor was inspired by Baroque depictions, which were made of silver and gold and highly ornamented. There's also a halo coming out of her helmet and flanking her face, with the pointed penitential hood pointed up toward God. Her cape is blue and gold, the colors associated with depictions of Mary. In the concept art for Crisanta, she's missing her left arm, something that does not translate into the final game. It was indicative of a previous iteration of her story. The first stage of Crisanta's fight was originally the entire fight in the base game. She's fairly aggressive in this stage, but fairly manageable, despite my mediocre performance here. She primarily attacks with sword slashes, and will also make aerial dives towards Penitente that send out a shockwave where she lands. A unique aspect of Crisanta's fight is that she'll hold up her sword and parry Penitente's attacks during this time, lashing out with a counterattack that can be parried by Penitente. This blocking stance, as well as her upward slashes, were actually inspired by Japanese katana techniques, giving her moves a novel touch compared to the Western sword techniques we've seen throughout the game. I find that parrying her counterattack opens her up well for a lunge attack, and that remaining aggressive and hounding her after she dives toward Penitente opens up a solid window of opportunity to deal decent damage. She's also parryable with her sword slashes, which I unfortunately don't demonstrate much here, and they can make this first stage go by pretty quickly by landing a few counterattacks. At 50% health in this first stage, she brings out the arena charge attacks that are sometimes accompanied by diagonal charges, and they're pretty easy to jump over or parry. As mentioned during Isidora, I think the pace of these charges makes them a pretty low threat overall, something that is fixed with Isidora to become more menacing. Despite my worst efforts to parry, I am able to take her out in this first stage. In the base game, the fight would end here, with Penitente doing a number of slashes against her before she flees. Because we have the apodictic heart of Mea Culpa equipped, she remains, and Stage 2 begins. Entering Stage 2, Crisanta tells Penitente 2 commandments she received from the High Wills. To avoid the kiss of Mea Culpa, which they say has been wholly tainted, and that she will continue to battle until her dying breath or until Penitente has been defeated. and for that, Crisanta says that her penance is far from over. The metaphor is represented very literally with Crisanta and her penitence of blindness, but she is the epitome of blind faith. She is so totally wrapped up in the fanaticism and rigid dogma of the church that she does not question if the state of Custodia and keeping Escribar in power is truly the right path, and she does not question if Penitente is anything more than another heretic and test of faith, even though he too has been clearly touched by the miracle. When I first played, I found myself at this point in the narrative questioning why the miracle is seemingly guiding both Crisanta and Penitente, as the High Wills are directly in Crisanta's ear and they brought Penitente back to life for his pilgrimage. Because at this point I think it is reasonably understood that the High Wills direct the miracle's actions, even if the exact relationship is still a bit obscured. I think the basic answer is stated at the beginning of the game, which is that the miracle is unknowable, blessing and cursing seemingly at random. Throughout our own history, many opposing sides have both claimed to be fighting on the side of God. That being said, I think there is an argument that this confrontation, as initially set up, benefits the High Wills either way. Custodia is stagnant after Escribar's faith in the miracle waned and he was martyred. The miracle gives Penitente mea culpa and resurrects him, sending him on a pilgrimage to dethrone Escribar in the current order to usher in a new age of worship. We will go over the specifics and the endings as we see them play out, but this is what we see in endings B and A, and in both cases I'd say that it's a win for the High Wills. However, what the High Wills did not expect from this process was their own power being challenged. And if you follow this line of reasoning to its logical conclusion, this could only happen if the Divine Trinity is not omnipotent, and we already have examples to reinforce this idea. Perpetua was able to whisper to Penitente behind her back from beyond the dream, and the fourth visage was able to hide the true power of mea culpa from them. And so, upon discovering the true power of mea culpa has been unlocked, that it can sever the invisible chains that will veil the eyes of the fervent, it becomes imperative to the High Wills that Crisanta defeat Penitente, not only to stop him from continuing his pilgrimage, but also so that Crisanta is not compromised, which is why she must defeat Penitente or fight to her dying breath. And Crisanta is not taking it easy on Penitente in Stage 2. Stage 2 Crisanta largely retains the moveset of Stage 1, but her attacks are quicker and more aggressive. Importantly, parrying her sword no longer opens her up to a counterattack, but instead deflects her attack and produces a bolt of purple lightning that can deal damage. Unfortunately for me, I fought vanilla Crisanta enough times before Wounds of Eventide that my follow-up lunge after parrying her counterattack resides in my muscle memory, a strategy that doesn't work so well against Stage 2 Crisanta. The window of opportunity to attack her before she strikes is shorter, resulting in me opening Penitente up to a few swings of the wrapped blade. And I think this is a good example of how the progression of Stage 1 into Stage 2 is a minor transition in her moveset on paper, but one that really elevates the fight. Gone is the ability to simply parry her to victory, and even though I think the hitbox on the resulting lightning is a bit harsh, I think it is a nice change. The same with her arena charges, which like Isidora are now not as numerous, but are deployed more quickly. It is an interesting fight for those who have played Blasphemous since the beginning, because the similarity in her moves in Stage 2 bait old habits that no longer work quite as well. I'm not sure if it's intentional to mess with people who got used to Stage 1, but it's an elegant and spicy solution that I really appreciate. Luckily, my sloppy play has made taking a death from Crisanta all the easier, and she defeats Penitente. This is all part of the plan though. For one, you may have noticed that we got 18k tears for beating her first phase, and will happen every time we beat it. And secondly, the once immaculate bead is now a bead marked by guilt, absorbing the guilt fragment that dropped upon Penitente's death. And with another death and 18k more tears, we now have the weight of true guilt, which we learn from the description were once held by confessors to reap guilt from the repentant. Below 50% health in Stage 2, Crisanta will begin to fire off waves of purple energy from her blade that deal high damage that can be parried. Most importantly, she will fall to one knee after this attack, opening her up for massive damage. If I had not been struck by her last wave, I may have fully taken her out here, and as it was, I had time to perform a lunge and get in a few good slashes. Unfortunately, she darts away with a magic pixel of health remaining, and I spend the next 15 seconds nearly missing her and abandoning all sense of composure. I land the final blow, however, snagging victory and another 21k tears for beating Stage 2, giving me more than enough tears to purchase any remaining skills and upgrades Penitente is missing. Crisanta, defeated, believes that mea culpa is tainted and will purge her soul, but that is not the case. Instead, Penitente reveals the chains that veil her heart, that veil the truth. Breaking the chains of the High Wills wounds her soul and kills her blind faith to the Church and the High Wills. And although her soul is wounded, it is actually not a new wound. Breaking the chains reveals a wound to Crisanta that she already had, bestowed upon her by the fourth visage in an attempt to reveal the truth to her and open her eyes, but was quickly closed by the chains of the High Wills, and the truth was obscured from Crisanta again. Crisanta tells Penitente that she will make her way to the chapel where she first met and killed Penitente. We will meet up with her when it is time for the true ending, but for now it is time to finally confront His Holiness Escribar.
Ahora dejadme sola con mi profunda herida.
The deambulatory of His Holiness precedes the Cradle of Affliction, where the turned throne sits atop the mountain of ash, left by Escribar's martyrdom in the form of the Great Tree. But before we move forward, I've got some tears burning a hole in my pocket. First, we visit Nacimiento, who has seen better days. Despite the pain, or because of it, he helps us upgrade the bioflask one last time. After doing so, he asks us to leave so that we will not witness what is about to happen, the birth of the Ancient One out of his chest. We've discussed how it seems likely that he was an alchemist eons old who extended his life through the use of quicksilver, and how the Ancient One appearing in his chest was the result of the miracle, which Nacimiento tells Penitente that he believes aiding him will relieve this curse. What I think we see here is that he was finally able to birth the Ancient One in his own death and cross into the dream, although the steady breaths of the Ancient One do leave it open-ended what exactly Nacimiento's ultimate fate might be. That being said, I also have one more idea regarding Nacimiento's story. The lore for Quicksilver states that it leaks through and hides under our feet, only to then sprout again free of impurity. It is your choice, my son, to pick them up or to leave them, but beware of the purpose you put them to. This is purely my own theory given what we discussed here, but part of the alchemical process may involve purifying the Quicksilver. And similar to Dorian Gray's portrait stated inspiration for Nacimiento, the Ancient One absorbs this impurity. As Penitente gives Nacimiento more Quicksilver, the Ancient One is further pushed or labored, as if the process of absorbing the impurity is the catalyst by which he is finally birthed, and Nacimiento is freed of his curse. But that is where the story of Nacimiento ends. Still dripping in tears, I purchased the remaining Mea Culpa upgrades. Mea Culpa's level of ascension and skills remain through New Game Plus playthroughs, and you really want to have everything Mea Culpa fully upgraded before going into New Game Plus. And the difficulty of the New Game Plus bosses does seem balanced around a fully upgraded Mea Culpa and access to all of Penitente's tricks. All upgraded, we head back to the deambulatory and prepare to fight Escribar. Escribar deals damage of all types, so I'm confirming here that I have the best elemental and physical defense speeds equipped. The weight of True Guilt is not needed at this time, so I swap it out for Kirce's Scorched Bead, which increases fire resistance by 35%. In my experience, fire resistance is particularly important, as one of Escribar's more troublesome attacks is his fire-based attack. I also make sure that Debla of the Lights is equipped, as it is very useful in the second stage of Escribar's fight. The architecture of this pathway and staircase was inspired by the Mudahar architecture of the Royal Palace of Seville, and Seville's famous bell tower, the Giralda. The gold lilies are a detail borrowed directly from the Giralda, which has gold lily ornamentation around the top of the bell tower. The vase-shaped ornamentation at the landings was inspired by similarly shaped ornamentation common to the Mudahar architecture in Seville. The interior continues with Mudahar architecture, but now introduces marble and other touches meant to evoke St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, to give that presentation of purity and majesty. And now Penitente speaks with the man behind it all, His Holiness Escribar. Escribar tells Penitente about how he dreamed of him, knowing nothing about him except for the visage of his helmet. In this dream, he could hear Penitente approach and tried to speak with him, to no avail because of his vow of silence. Escribar never states it outright, but I believe these dreams of Escribar's were the catalyst for his order to kill the Brotherhood of the Silent Sorrow. Knowing nothing about Penitente besides the appearance of his helmet, Escribar did not know who among the Brotherhood would come to depose him, and so he branded all of them heretics and ordered them all to be killed. Escribar gives his credentials as the head honcho, as guardian of the miracle, bearing the emblem of the Father, aka the infinity symbol at the top right, and acting as the eyes of Mother Church, watching Penitente's approach. Escribar refuses to see that he rules over ruins and that the miracle has brought his bane to his doorstep, and hides behind his titles. He seems offended that this nameless penitent would come challenge him, even though he carries the guilty blade. And so His Holiness Escribar appears for stage 1 of the final boss fight. For what will be ending B, the stage is pretty breezy, with the complication being that Escribar will shield himself from damage while summoning one of his elemental attacks. So the fight ends up being broken roughly into 2 modes, where you're dodging and jumping to avoid attacks while he is shielded, and where you're wailing on him when he is not. However, immediately closing the distance with a lunge attack and dealing enough damage will cause him to teleport away before casting, a tactic that can be abused throughout the fight to end it very quickly. Depending on the attack, his shield will not last the entire time, and in the case of the fireballs, running from one end and then back gives you adequate spacing to avoid fireballs and come back around to deal a lot of damage to his pretty meager health bar. I'm always a bit torn on these kind of 2-stage fights where the first stage is a pushover. In this case, I do kind of wish that subsequent attempts would begin at stage 2, as the first stage ends up being so easy to get through that it doesn't really act as a bile flask tax or a test of endurance, with the dialogue at the start lasting longer than the fight. Within the lore, Penitente is being brought back to life by the miracle as well, so it makes sense to me that after shattering the illusion of Escribar's appearance once, that it would start stage 2 on subsequent runs. Now it's time for stage 2, where Escribar becomes his true self and goes by the title Last Son of the Miracle. First of all, what a sick design. I just love his appearance in this stage. In this fight, you need to smack the eye on the sword while avoiding swings from the sword as well as elemental spells. Once you deal enough damage to the eye, the faceplate will open up and you can deal damage to the last son's health bar. One kind of janky aspect about this fight is that unless you use something like Devil of the Lights, you're relying on these platforms of ash around the face to be able to deal damage. The issue I have with this is that they disappear and reappear in random configurations, and it's pretty easy to get bad luck with the configuration of platforms and not be able to deal much damage before the faceplate closes up and the cycle begins again. You can see me struggle to make my way up to his face for the final attack, but I do it and we are all rewarded with this amazing death animation for Escribar. We get a glimpse of Escribar ascending as the fight ends, and is a little preview of what we will be up against in the true ending. After a pregnant pause with Penitente standing in the deambulatory once again, we get Summa Blasphemia, aka Highest Blasphemy, for killing the Pope. Badass. With Escribar out of the way, it is time to head into the inner sanctum. Penitente has finally reached the Cradle of Affliction, and we can see the turned throne atop the mountain of ash. The narrator of the miracle, our boy Deo Gracias, must have snuck in during the chaos and now waits for us. He explains that atop the ash mountain and beside Escribar's turned throne is the cradle of the grievous miracle. It is there where Penitente's final communion with the miracle will take place, assuming he can reach the summit. As discussed previously, many others tried to climb the Mount of Ash after Escribar's martyrdom to try and claim the throne, only to sink into its depths and reappear as the monsters Penitente has encountered during his pilgrimage. Deo Gracias says that we will see how much guilt has seeped into Penitente's heart, and bids him farewell. Unfortunately, in ending B, Penitente is found wanting by the miracle, the true weight of guilt not realized in his heart. He sinks into the ash like so many before him, swallows sins and sinners alike, as Deo Gracias puts it, the miracle showing Penitente no mercy either. Deo Gracias grabs the empty helmet of Penitente and discards it into a pile of other Brotherhood penitential helmets, saying that Penitente's penitence is over. Try saying that 5 times fast. Man, what a gut punch this ending was the first time I got it. It is the brutal but delicious moment of beating the big bad Escribar, only to moments later not be able to get up a hill. It's such a humbling moment right at the climax of the game that while it might be narratively a bit unsatisfying, is such good intersection between the play and themes of the game that just feels kinda right. I do want to note that I don't think the Brotherhood helmets are supposed to imply cycles or anything soulsy like that, but instead that Penitente has become yet another nameless visage who tried and failed to sit upon the turned throne, and I think Deo Gracias' words here back that up. I see this ending as a failure to make any meaningful change. Escribar might be gone, but no one has replaced him, and Custodia is still in ruins. This is a non-canon ending officially, so we are pretty free to speculate, but given that Penitente did open Crisanta's eyes in this game, perhaps she may be able to claim the mea culpa and mount the throne. In a game where Crisanta remains chained by the High Wills, perhaps she may find her way to ending A by doing what Penitente could not and ascend the Mountain of Ash. We get the true apostasy skin for our efforts and a new game mode that has been unlocked. The Sacred Sorrows are a boss rush mode added with Strife and Ruin, and unlocks after you beat the game for the first time. This mode was added to fulfill a stretch goal unlocked during the Kickstarter campaign, and although I'm only going to cover this mode generally, I think it's pretty robust for those who like a boss rush mode. The way it works is that after selecting Sacred Sorrows in the main menu, you choose a save file to use for the challenge, and Penitente during the sorrow will have the same attributes and items as Penitente in the chosen save file. This includes any of the penitences that might be active on the chosen character. There is only one sorrow available at the start, but there are 6 sorrows players can unlock and complete. And players can choose between Pilgrim and True Torment mode for each sorrow, which corresponds to the power of the bosses in New Game for Pilgrim and New Game Plus for True Torment. Once chosen, Penitente is dropped into a room with a health and fervor chalice, as well as a portal to the next boss fight. The chalices can be used once to replenish fervor and health during the first 4 sorrows, with some special exceptions applied to the 5th and 6th sorrows. Once the portal is entered, a timer will start that will continuously run during the remainder of the sorrow, and is what determines the player's rating at the end of the run. As mentioned, the Penitente of this challenge has the same health and fervor as the Penitente in the game shown during this commentary, including the quantity and quality of the bile flasks. As in the main game, you are able to adjust your beads and prayers on the fly, though it won't stop the timer from counting up. This first sorrow covers the bosses in the first half of the game, which are not too much of a challenge when using a Penitente with endgame stats and equipment, even despite not having a prayer equipped for some reason during this run. The Sacred Sorrows mode is a nice addition to the game, and having the wrinkle that it uses the Penitente from one of your save files gives a lot of variety and personal challenges you can stack up upon the various sorrows that give it a fair amount of replayability beyond chasing the S rank for all of the sorrows. At the end of the run, you're given a rank depending on how long it took you to beat the sorrow, as well as some other fun stats about the run like the bile flask used, dodges performed, and hits received. I'll admit that I don't really play Blasphemous strictly for the boss fights, so I haven't beaten all the sorrows, but I think it's a well-designed mode for those who love boss rushes and ranked fights. Now let's hop back into the main game and continue the pilgrimage to ending A. After beating the game, Penitente is put just back to before fighting Escribar. Players can go into New Game Plus called True Torment mode at any time from the save file menu, but we are going to stick to New Game for now so that we can get Ending A in the same run. Ending A is unlocked by destroying all 7 of the Confessor statues and beating the sanctum within the portal that appears on the floor where the Confessor statue stood. However, the red portals can only be interacted with if Penitente has the true Weight of Guilt prayer bead equipped, which is why we took a few lucrative deaths against Crisanta to transform the Immaculate Bead. These sanctums are wave-based combat arenas that will vary in layout and encounter design, and difficulty corresponding to the area in which the Confessor statue is located. While scaling the difficulty with the area works perfectly fine, and the enemies recall the flavor of encounter design in the corresponding area, it is a bit of a cakewalk here in Mercy Dreams with my fully buffed out Penitente. This approach makes me think these Confessor statue sanctums were designed to be tackled as you progress through the game, but I don't think that's how it's likely to play out. In my experience and the anecdotal accounts of others I've spoken with, these sanctums are most often tackled at the end of the game after getting Ending B, much like we have in this playthrough. And in this scenario, I think the relative ease with which these are completed feels just a bit out of step with the challenge one might expect as they pursue what was once considered the good or true ending of the game prior to Wounds of Eventide. And the knock-on effect of it being a bit easy is that it lays bare a bit of the tedium involved in going around to the 7 Confessor statues and completing these sanctums. And that isn't to say that these wave-based arenas are bad. If anything, they highlight the merits of the generally well-designed enemies and the various configurations of encounters they can be deployed. But I personally think that scaling up the challenge to be more in line with endgame encounters might have been a fun way to push the limits on the tactics and skills players have accrued over the course of the game. Beating the sanctum is signified by the phrase Distatio Sacrorum. This Latin phrase was a historical rite in Roman society where a person moving from one family to another due to adoption or other reasons renounced their previously held religious beliefs and duties for the religious beliefs and duties of the new family. Within the context of Blasphemous, I take this rite that Penitente is performing as a means of abolishing the old order of Escribar, the Mother of Mothers, and even the Twisted One, the Father, and ushering in a new era. For completing this first sanctum, we get some tears as well as the budding sprout item. This is the first transformation of the thorn that we received from Deo Gracias at the beginning of the game when we first met him, in which he told Penitente that when he grips Mea Culpa and it wounds him with sprouted thorns twisting over the grip, that he will be at the mercy of the grievous miracle. The thorns item description states that these thorns from the miracle feed on sin and guilt, growing with the burden its bearer carries. So in performing this rite of leaving the old order, Penitente is absorbing and bearing the entirety of the guilt of Custodia, illustrated by the growth of the thorns as the sanctums are completed. The Christ parallels are pretty strong here, with Penitente bearing the guilt of Custodia as Jesus bore the sins of the world in the Bible, both doing so as a savior in order to establish a new paradigm. The thorn will continue to grow over the course of the 7 sanctums, until after beating the final sanctum it becomes the Custodia of Guilt, bearing the guilt of all of Custodia, and is the key item needed to unlock Ending A. Unlike the location of the Confessors in the world, the reward for completing these arenas is related to how many you've completed in total. You get tears from 3 of them, but will also get a sword heart and 3 prayer beads along the way. The sword heart is the heart of the single tone, which lets Penitente knock down some magic projectiles with Mea Culpa at the cost of being weaker against taking elemental damage. This can be useful especially against Escribar, who uses a lot of magic projectiles, although the lower elemental defense is a steep price to pay. The final reward, the prayer bead, the seashell of the inverted spiral, increases all elemental resistances by 10%, which can help out with this, but ultimately doesn't do much to mitigate the double damage Penitente takes from elemental attacks while the heart is equipped. Besides Escribar, most other bosses and enemies stick with one elemental type of damage, so this feels like it could work well for anyone struggling in particular with Escribar's attacks, although I personally don't tend to find a spot for this bead that I wouldn't rather fill with something more offensively or defensively powerful. An interesting note regarding these combat arena fights is that the lead level designer Enrique Colone mentioned these fights as something from Blasphemous 1 that they wanted to explore more in the sequel. Those who follow the channel might remember them a bit critical in arena fights in Metroidvanias for 2 reasons. The primary reason is that I think they negatively impact the level design after they are beaten, if they are left as these oddly large and empty rooms, an issue I've seen to varying degrees in the Metroidvania genre. The second reason is that I just don't find these cage fights as compelling as your typical encounters as you explore the world, as by necessity the waves of different enemy configurations are not as specifically designed to respond to the geometry as regular encounters. So one thing I like about these arenas is how they don't take up real estate in the typical map, and is a boon in favor of how these are designed. They're also fairly enjoyable fights with some decent twists in the design of the arena, although I still prefer the regular encounters in Blasphemous. So overall, I think these sanctums sidestep the biggest issues I have with arena fights and action platformers, with my main criticism being that they're perhaps a bit too easy by the time players are likely to encounter them, and maybe a bit less grandiose than the challenge I'd imagine would befit the quote-unquote original good ending of the game. As for Blasphemous 2, this was an interesting choice to me when I heard it as something the Game Kitchen intended to iterate on, but my feelings about the end result in Blasphemous 2 are for another video. Once Penitente has completed all 7 Sanctums and obtained the Custodia of Sin, it is time to face Escribar once again. The fight with Escribar remains the same, so I won't rehash the conversation about the fight, although I won't pass up the opportunity to show his death animation once again. Now, bearing the entire guilt of Custodia, Penitente makes his way up the mountain of ash, no longer being swallowed up before he can reach the top. He has come to understand the true weight of guilt and bears it for everyone, so his sin no longer drags him down. At the summit he reaches the turned throne with the mea culpa. Penitente takes his place upon the throne and stabs himself in the stomach as a final communion with the guilty blade, mirroring the lady at the beginning of the game and the creation of the mea culpa. This was the original happy ending, Blasphemous style. Penitente sacrificed himself as a final penance, ending the age of the grievous miracle. He becomes the new father, the new icon through which the miracle is worshipped. His skin turns to wood, the turned throne is removed from the Mother of Mothers, and he is paraded around in processions just like the Twisted One once was, and how real-life saints were. The final shot I see as a sunrise, representing this new era for Custodia and the miracle, and yet the image fades out to some ominous words. One of my favorite lines in the game, penance never ends, but changes, hurts, and condemns at will. The miracle is capricious, and although Penitente ended the age of the grievous miracle, the miracle will return and do what it does. The high wills will continue the cycle of faith, into passion, into self-destruction. And sadly for our boy, Penitente is stuck on this side of the dream as the new father, the new recipient of Custodia's prayers. Credits begin to play, but like with Ending B, Ending A has a cutscene at the end. Crisanta takes mea culpa and pulls it out of Penitente's stomach. As with Ending B, this ending will occur the same way regardless if we unchained Crisanta or not, so I'd say that this scene was originally meant to imply that she would follow through on her orders to erase Penitente from history, taking the guilty blade for who knows what end. Perhaps this is Crisanta deposing Penitente, just as Penitente deposed Escribar. However, given that a more sympathetic Crisanta was introduced in the Wounds of Eventide, this could be Crisanta taking up Penitente's mantle, intending to ultimately fulfill the role he plays in the true ending. Either way, we get the Crimson and Silver, Son of the Miracle skin. We've discussed briefly the existence of New Game Plus, added with the Stir of Dawn DLC and how it features new bosses and story content. Well, now it is time to talk about New Game Plus, called True Torment mode, penitences, and the Amanecidas. To access True Torment mode, we ascend our file, and the game explains the basics of New Game Plus. Enemies will be tougher and hit harder, but Penitente will keep all mea culpa upgrades, sword hearts, rosary beads, prayers, and relics. In addition, the Altar of Penitence will be unlocked. At the start of the run, players are given the option to take on a penitence at the altar. I think an important thing to note about penitences is that they're not challenge runs as much as alternative modes of play that change how you typically approach the game, and I think they do a really good job at it. There are 3 penitences available to take, and you can also play New Game Plus without one. You can also quit a penitence at any point in the run, but will not be able to choose a penitence again until the next run. The 3 penitences are Penitence of True Guilt, Penitence of Unwavering Faith, and the Penitence of the Bleeding Heart. In the Penitence of the True Guilt, Blasphemous gets a bit more soulsy by having Penitente drop all tears with their guilt fragment when they die, and that all tears will be lost by failing to retrieve the guilt fragment before dying again. In addition, each death gives the maximum guilt penalty to the fervor bar, and perhaps most importantly, bile flasks no longer replenish health, but fervor instead. The major downside here is the lack of traditional healing, which can be medicated by prayers like Saeta Dolorosa and the Heart of Boiling Blood, or you can just use Tiento to your thorned hairs to avoid damage altogether. The major upside is that you now refill your fervor, letting you cast prayers almost infinitely, especially mid-game and beyond as Penitente gains more bile flasks. This penitence makes you into a glass cannon and is a lot of fun for playing with prayers. Because I find switching between prayers through the menu to be overly tedious to do very often, I tended to stick to a spell in an area or boss and focus on offense, and found a lot of fun in seeing how a particular spell fares in various situations. The reward for beating the game with this penitence is the Reliquary of the Sorrowful Heart Prayer Bead, which turns bile flasks into fervor flasks, which can be pretty powerful. In the Penitence of the Unwavering Faith, Mea Culpa is not getting it done anymore. Melee attacks are half as effective as they normally are. On the other hand, Fervor now regenerates over time, although taking damage will also reduce Fervor. Between the ineffective melee attacks and the Fervor loss from taking damage, this penitence is all about staying back to use spells and the Fervorous Blood. This makes the Heart of Smoking Incense, which buffs both prayer and fervorous blood damage for additional fervor, pretty clutch. This heart also increases the duration of prayers, so my strategy most of the time was to sling fervorous blood primarily while using Tiento or Zarabanda of the Safe Haven to mitigate damage dealt to Penitente. Learning to not hack and slash and approach enemies and bosses from a distance is no small adjustment, but I like this change in perspective in adjusting how I react to boss moves to make sure I have time to throw fervorous blood unscathed. For beating this penitence, you get the Reliquary of the Fervent Heart Prayer Bead, which makes Penitente's fervor regenerate over time. I find this to be wildly useful in a normal game to always stay topped off so you can cast a prayer, but I think this is the mechanic combined with the nerfed Mea Culpa that really makes this run interesting. Penitence of the Bleeding Heart, in which your health turns into Hollow Knight or Zelda-esque pips, might be my favorite penitence. Using a bile flask immediately heals one orb of damage, and then will slowly regenerate more health orbs until health is maxed or Penitente takes damage, whichever comes first. And last, enemies will respawn when you re-enter a room. Penitente's health as orbs is a real game changer, and in more ways than might initially be apparent. Every attack that hits Penitente does one orb of damage, meaning that at the start of the game, every enemy attack does 1/3 of Penitente's health, which is massive, and you'll be hunting for those empty bile flasks right away. Of course, this means that as you gain more orbs, each attack is doing a smaller chunk of your health, which sometimes ends up being a boon in the endgame. What makes this penitence shine for me is that with all damage equalized, defensive prayer beads don't really do anything. Opening up a whole bunch of bead slots to power up Penitente and try out beads that don't get as much play. This also means that sword hearts that lowered Penitente's defense as a downside effectively don't have that downside anymore, making hearts like the Heart of Oils or the Heart of the Single Tone much more viable. While bile flasks are less effective, and by the way they only regenerate health faster with Quicksilver when upgraded, they don't give more hearts immediately, the increased range of build options that opens up is a worthwhile trade-off and makes the run a particularly unique experience. And it is the way the penitences shake up how you approach the game that makes them so much more interesting and fun than simply being a challenge mode, and what I think makes NG Plus and Blasphemous 1 particularly robust and satisfying. Getting to play with all of your toys at the start of the game is already pretty cool, especially in Metroidvanias, where that means you unlock new progression routes too, but then also challenging you to rethink how you use those toys with the penitences makes it all so much richer. All that being said, we haven't even discussed the added story content and bosses added in Stir of Dawn and found only in New Game Plus, Laudes, and the Amanecidas. Because we have the Petrified Bell, we are able to open this door underneath the Holy Line in Petrus, and is where we meet Ibrael. Hebrael was touched by the miracle, chosen to be the messenger of the Sierpes, an ancient song that will wake the Amanecidas at the time the miracle deems right. It was the miracle that grew his arms and twisted a bronze bugle around them, weighing him down and bending his back. Now that Penitente has opened the chamber, Hebrael will go where the miracle directs him and play the Sierpes, which will resonate with the miracle and exhume the crystal sarcophagi of the Amanecidas. So in New Game Plus, we will periodically encounter Hebrael throughout Custodia, where he will make the bronze sing and exhume one of the Amanecidas, allowing Penitente to interact with the sarcophagus and go into a pocket dimension to fight one of them. The encounters with Hebrael are also how we learn the story, as he will tell us a bit about Laudes and the Amanecidas. Laudes was a woman with immense passion and devotion to the Twisted One. Such was the intensity of her devotion that her body could not bear it, resulting in the pores of her skin opening up one night and passion pouring forth through them in the form of liquid gold. The High Wills formed this liquid gold into 4 women, Laudes' devotion incarnate. They became known as the 5 Dons or the Amanecidas. The Stir of Dawn DLC is called Levantes de la Aurora in Spanish, which the Game Kitchen explained in a tweet is a line pulled from a 16th century poet and priest San Juan de la Cruz's poem, The Spiritual Canticle. This poem is an allegory for the mystical spirit journey of the soul for God through the imagery of a bride in search of her groom. The line being referenced in the poem is within the context of a night of spiritual sleep, in which the dawn comes as the divine light of a spiritual awakening. And this stir of dawn is what happens to Laudes. Amanecida comes from amanecer, which means dawn or awakening. A Spanish friend of mine who helped explain this to me also noted that this is kind of an older word that is not commonly used now. Amanecer meaning an awakening is similar to how something can dawn on you in English, in which dawn here is having a sudden realization. I like how Amanecida was chosen to remain in Spanish instead of getting translated to the awakened or something like that, as this helps retain the dawn imagery while differentiating dawn as an allegory for spiritual awakening from the dawn as the time of day. It keeps it in alignment with the Spanish, where aurora and Amanecida are used, and thus the different implication is more apparent. To paraphrase my friend, the aurora is the light itself and the awakened have seen the light, aka the dawn is the Twisted One and the Amanecidas have seen this light in a spiritual awakening. The bride has found her groom, allegorically. The Amanecidas guarded the Twisted One in processions, and they sang the Sierpes to let people know that they approached with the Father, who is still alive in his divine prison of pain and piety. And although it isn't stated directly, I like to speculate that Hebrael was part of the procession, playing a bugle not yet entangled with his body. However, there was a problem. The miracle was jealous of the Amanecida's passion for the Twisted One and wanted all of that devotion for itself. And even though Hebrael says the miracle, I think that it was the High Wills who wanted that devotion. It was them who created the Twisted One after all, and as I've discussed, having devotion and faith of the custodians is important to them. So the Amanecidas and their fervor were condemned, placed in glass sarcophagi deep within the earth until they were called upon. And it is here where I think the story of Laudes and the Amanecidas has an interesting intersection with San Juan de la Cruz's poem. The bride of the spiritual canticle makes sense alongside Laudes, in that they both have this mystical spiritual awakening, but they diverge in that Laudes is punished for her devotion to the Twisted One and not the High Wills. This could just be the blasphemous touch. Creative director Enrique Cabeza did state that the miracle would take something and distort and contort it, and we see Spanish history and art getting some level of distortion or poetic literalization in Blasphemous. However, there is some historical context that I think comes into play with this particular reference. San Juan de la Cruz was trying to reform the Carmelite order, which was seen as a divisive act by some of his fellow Carmelites. So divisive, in fact, that he was abducted by some of his superiors in the order, where he was taken to Toledo and held captive for 9 months in a repurposed latrine and flogged 3 times a week. It was during these 9 months that he wrote the spiritual canticle. San Juan de la Cruz was punished for not worshipping how his superiors wanted him to. This is of course not exactly the same situation as Laudes and the Amanecidas, but I think there was an undeniable resonance between the punishment of San Juan de la Cruz for how he desired to express his faith and how Laudes was punished for how she expressed hers. For me, this not only takes the beauty of de la Cruz's words of faith in a literal sense that creates the story of Laudes and the Amanecidas, but also acts as a means to reflect upon those structural powers that would condemn faith for being expressed in what is perceived as an incorrect way. And although San Juan de la Cruz escaped his captors and the Amanecidas would be put into sepulchres deep beneath the earth, San Juan de la Cruz would go on to be one of the incorruptible, or a saint whose body miraculously did not decompose after death, which is just kind of interesting. In addition to being an interesting story, the Amanecidas are also very solid boss fights. I'm discussing this series of boss fights simultaneously, as there is a fair amount of overlap between them, while also all having unique aspects of their movesets that keep the fights interesting. All of these fights take place in these pocket dimensions that are visually similar to the Guardian Visage dream. This dream also features dawn beginning to rise behind a vista that also includes the skulls of the Amanecidas. Over the course of the fights, you can see dawn progress, the sun rising a bit more with each fight. A mechanical through line for the fights is this purple crystal shield that will cover the Amanecidas at the beginning of the fight, making them invulnerable. The shield will slowly crack when damaged, eventually shattering, allowing Penitente to deal damage to the boss health bar. The bosses will periodically try to regenerate that shield, but they can be knocked out of the regeneration by taking enough damage. It is pretty easy to keep the shield from regenerating, and ends up functioning primarily as a good damage window, but should you find yourself healing or at a distance when it starts and the boss regenerates, it's a real pain in the ass. There are also recurring attacks among the Amanecidas, which are a ground slam shockwave attack that you need to jump over, and waves of energy thrown at Penitente that are very similar to the energy waves cast by Crisanta near the end of her fight. Otherwise, each fight has a unique set of attacks corresponding to the weapon they carry that does give some meaningful difference to these fights. I have some reservations about keeping these bosses strictly in New Game Plus. This does allow the game kitchen to design them and balance them against a Penitente with a kit of prayers and mea culpa skills, and it shows. They are pretty agile bosses for Blasphemous, demanding that Penitente quickly close gaps and make use of full attack combos when possible to whittle down their substantial health bar. It would have killed the pacing to have a run of bosses like this all reversed for the end of the game, so I think putting them in New Game Plus was a good move, and spreading them out across the game while also being able to design around a Penitente with all the tricks up his sleeve. These fights culminate with Laudes, the first Amanecida, atop the Ferris tree, the massive sculpture of His Holiness Escribar on the turned throne that separates the Mother of Mothers from the rest of Custodia. After beating the other 4 Amanecidas out in the world, the gate to the far side of the Hall of Dawning opens for Penitente, allowing him to ascend to the summit of trees. There we finally meet Laudes herself with her awesome 5-faced mask. She tells us that she has struck a bargain with the miracle to rise again in exchange for putting Penitente and his irreverent intention down. The fight is a culmination of the Amanecida's rites, with Laudes bearing the weapons of Amanecidas roughly in the reversed order they were fought in. At the beginning of each of the 4 phases, she is protected by the purple crystal shield, which must be broken to damage her. Each phase will then end with an uninterruptible regeneration of the shield, in which she will draw a new weapon. Although this fight isn't really presenting anything new, and isn't really too challenging as a result, it is a dynamic fight that feels climactic. On the whole, I think these fights really show the game kitchen pushing the boundaries of the combat system. Their addition to the True Torment experience, combined with the Penitent system, really makes New Game Plus my preferred way to play Blasphemous 1, with the only downside being that the Wounds of Eventide fights, Isidora, Sierpes, and Crisanta, become real damage sponges in New Game Plus. It It is hard to overstate how much of a game changer the Stir of Dawn DLC was when it came out. Beyond the Amanecidas, True Torment, and the Penitences, it was with this DLC that multiple areas received visual overhauls, pre-do upgrades were added, and the stagger system was overhauled to let lunge and charge attacks open up certain enemies for executions. It was a big deal and a testament not only to the team's dedication to the game, but also to video games as a living art form. It's easy to get cynical about games releasing in an unfinished state, but our modern experience with games also allows devs to take feedback and get some more time to realize a game's potential, and I believe Blasphemous is a shining example of that. And as we reach the finale of the added story content with the Stir of Dawn, I think it's worth considering it within the greater context of the game. We have seen over the course of the game this recurring theme about Custodia being frozen in an eternal sunset, and I have drawn a direct parallel between this and the waning state of Custodia and its religion. Add into that the motifs of frozen iron versus flowing gold. It is no coincidence to me that we fight Laudes, a being whose devotion to the Twisted One was so intense that her passion poured out of her as liquid gold, on top of the iron statue of Escribar, depicting his martyrdom after turning his throne away from his congregation of Custodia because he believed their devotion was not enough. It directly contrasts the flowing gold and dawn of Laudes' devotion against the frozen iron and endless dusk of Escribar's rule of the Mother of Mothers. Creative director Enrique Cabeza told me in my interview with him that the Stir of Dawn story was a chance to further flesh out Custodia through this other tale. And what I see here, and what I believe was intentional setup for the Wounds of Eventide, is a story of a dawning spiritual awakening at the beginning of this era of the miracle with the Twisted One. It is not only a story of Laudes' personally extraordinary passion of flowing gold, but of the dawn of this era in Custodia, as belief and devotion flourished before orthodoxy and radicalism corrupted everything. With Laudes defeated, sent to the other side of the dream, Penitente is left atop Escribar's big iron head, the cloud occluded sunlight in the background. This skyscape is abruptly disrupted as Penitente crosses screens, returning to the usual endless dusk of Custodia, a move that I think is cool and plays into the mystical nature of the space where we just fought Laudes. Penitente drops down from the summit of the statue and onto Escribar's face. With a pretty obvious glint to the player, Penitente hammers his way into Escribar's big iron head through his eye. Upon breaking through, we get confirmation that Escribar is head empty, no thoughts, sparing a few golden cobwebs and a broken sword heart altar with an item on the ground. This item is the brilliant heart of Dawn sword heart. This gold and blue heart, the colors of Laudes' verses spun in gold of her saeta, as well as the colors of the Virgin Mary, gives Penitente a significant burst of speed after dodging, as well as taking double damage. Back in the Hall of Dawning is Hibrael, who's in what looks like an incredibly uncomfortable praying position. He is praying that Laudes has been freed, that her punishment has ended, and that she can cross to the other side of the dream. Hibrael also prays that he not be left here alone after all of this time, and that he can join Laudes on the other side of the dream. He then fades out, and I think what we see here is him bodily ascending to the other side of the dream. After fading, he says that great happiness awaits him, which I take to mean as him realizing that he is in fact going to be with Laudes on the other side of the dream as he wished, and is filled with happiness as a result. Or to put it another way, I am assuming that Hibrael was assumed. Similar to Hibrael, it is time to fade out of the Stir of Dawn and get to the canon ending of Blasphemous. After defeating Crisanta atop the Mother of Mothers, she asks us to meet her in the chapel where the first kneeling occurred, where Penitente first got mea culpa, and where Crisanta slayed him prior to the start of the game. Here we find Esdras and Crisanta. Crisanta appears wounded, which makes sense because we stabbed her a whole lot when we last fought, ultimately severing the chains of the high wheels from around her heart. She says not to worry, that the crimson cords of the Anointed Legion blessed by Escribar, protect her from being wounded. She tells Penitente that he and his sword and Holy Communion are the only thing that can end the eternal twilight that Custodia has been cursed with. The mea culpa with its true core, the apodictic heart, can challenge the intentions of the powers that created it. And who created the mea culpa? Whose intentions might be challenged by the completed guilty blade? For those who might still be unclear about the nature of the high wills and the miracle, she lays it out. The high wills pull the strings, they are distinct from the miracle and direct the acts of the miracle. However, there is part of this dialogue I want to clarify. Crisanta describes the high wills as being greater than the church and the miracle, which could be misinterpreted as the high wills being more divine than the miracle, or being above the miracle in power. Lead designer Michael Ortega clarified this point in the official Blasphemous Discord, saying that the high wills are not above the miracle, and that it doesn't work like that. This distinction about the high wills and the miracle will be borne out later on, and we will discuss it in full detail then. But I wanted to make the clarification now that the high wills command the miracle, but they are not more ascendant or more powerful. Crisanta then goes on to explain that the high wills can be found on the other side of the dream, on the path of eternal processions. However, there is a catch. In order to reach this place, a soul needs to obtain supreme absolution by experiencing supreme suffering. So this means a few things. First, Penitente must know the true weight of guilt by bearing the guilt of the entire peoples of the land of Custodia through the Custodia of sin. As with ending A, this allows Penitente to reach the summit of the Mountain of Ash, where the Turned Throne sits. The other thing Penitente needs is the fourth of the Holy Wounds, which was given to Crisanta by the fourth visage, the Holy Wound of Abnegation. This was given to Crisanta by the fourth visage in order to open her silvered eyes to the true nature of the high wills, but were closed quickly by the chains. The completed mea culpa broke these chains, however, allowing Crisanta to see, and allowing her to bestow it upon Penitente, who bears the guilt of Custodia and wields the guilty blade that can challenge those who created it. Abnegation is the act or renouncing or rejecting of something. Especially within the context of Catholicism, it usually means some form of self-denial. Lent, a time of year in which Catholics forgo something good to focus more on God, is an act of abnegation. However, I'd like to suggest that the Game Kitchen is playing with the meaning a bit here. The item lore says, Holy Creed, Forbidden Verse, is only the fourth wound that, unlike its sisters, makes the soul suffer in a way that goes beyond repentance as an act, and beyond guilt as a perpetual state. It is only the fourth that represents the deepest and most forbidden pain, the greatest and truest wound of the lost soul, the wounds of Eventide. You know it's important when they put the title of the DLC in the item description. This description of the Holy Wound of Abnegation is put in direct connection with Crisanta's eyes being opened to the truth of the High Wills, a truth that they tried to hide by shutting her eyes and casting out the fourth visage, who saw the High Wills and recognized this truth. I've danced around this long enough, and soon it will be discussed in more detail, but the basics of this truth is that the High Wills are not God. So I think on one level abnegation is being played with here in that, while it typically means self-denial in a religious context, here it means a rejection of the High Wills as divine, which is the basis of their authority. However, the description also has this really beautiful line about going beyond repentance as an act and beyond guilt as a perpetual state. This extreme orthodoxy of the church, arguably the basis of faith in Custodia, is about the process of guilt and repentance. This wound is about recognizing that you don't have to be part of this cycle, that devotion and faith doesn't have to be about guilt, that spirituality isn't about following these rules. To put it simply, I think the Holy Wound of Abnegation is about Crisanta losing her belief in the Church and the High Wills. This is the pain of losing her faith, the sun setting on this era of her life, the wound of Eventide. While Laudes' story is about a woman's spiritual awakening, Crisanta's story on the other end is about a woman breaking from a belief and system that has become toxic and corrupt. And in both cases, these personal stories can be applied to Custodia, with Crisanta's mission to Penitente being to bring down the system, to not allow the High Wheels to keep perpetuating this grand cycle of guilt and repentance, to truly bring this era to a close by cutting down the Trinity. I love how they developed Crisanta in this DLC. Whereas Penitente is kind of less a person and more an avatar of penance and guilt, Crisanta is a character who goes on an arc over the course of the game, from her blind faith and devotion to a bad system, to being an integral part of bringing it down. And as we will soon see, I think this ending was a needed aspect of the story to reconcile themes of faith with the Spanish Inquisition allegory that is the era of the Grievous Miracle. So we kill the last son of the miracle once again, speak to our boy Deo Gracias, and make our way to the summit of the Mountain of Ash where the Turned Throne sits. This time, instead of sitting down in the chair and sheathing mea culpa into Penitente's gut, his supreme absolution summons a lift to take him across to the other side of the dream to the land of the ancient processions. I kinda love the dorky representation of this metaphysical journey to heaven as a fancy elevator that brings Penitente up through the roof of the Grand Cathedral. It is a similar level of surrealism as the elevator from the Graveyard of the Peaks down to Albero, and I get a kick out of it every time. Penitente is now in the land of the eternal processions, standing on top of the processional floats, which will act as platforms for the final boss fight of the game. It is Escribar, of course, this time in the form we saw him when he ascended after defeating him as the last son of the miracle. Escribar tells Penitente that he has become a sentinel to the sacred home of the miracle. I see this as a continuation of Escribar's penance, seeing as he's not really a part of the procession but a guard dog of the High Wills. The item description of the Holy Wound of Abnegation reinforces this, saying that it allows you to walk the path beyond the Turned Throne, the final phase of the pilgrimage to a land of palliums and velvet that were forever denied to the Pontiff Escribar. It sounds to me like he's cursed to always be outside of the procession for his weakness in faith that led to his martyrdom. Escribar asks Penitente what he hopes to find here that is not the blinding gray light that tempers their wounds and the endless horizon. I think that as much as he speaks about being a sentinel of the miracle, he has not seen the miracle or the High Wills in this place. And I wouldn't be surprised if most of those who walk in the endless procession also do not see the High Wills in this place, considering how averse they are to being seen. I think what most people are focused on is the blinding gray light mentioned by Escribar, which I want you to keep in mind for now. After a few more sentences amounting to "I'm gonna kill you," the boss fight begins with Escribar, Sentinel of the Eternal Procession, which I don't really love as a fight. You keep your flasks as they were, but you have no access to your prayers or beads, leaving you with good old mea culpa. The challenge and frustration of this fight lies in the platforming. This arena auto-scrolls from right to left as you fight Escribar, so you have to manage your footing on the platforms and Escribar's attacks simultaneously. Neither the platforming nor the attacks are particularly challenging to deal with, but taken together it can be chaotic, and it's pretty easy to find yourself in a bad place where Escribar's attacks make it very difficult to stay on the platforms. This mixture of low challenge and mild chaos makes the fight feel a bit tedious to me. The lightning attack, in which bolts of lightning come down in columns, was of particularly notable frustration to me, as hitting the bolt knocks Penitente a good distance and would often threaten to bump me off the platform I'm on or prevent my jump to another platform, and sometimes both. The fire and toxic attacks are pretty easy to manage overall, as you can break the toxic orbs and you can out-platform the fire without too much of an issue, but these attacks could pair up with a lightning attack and end an attempt if Penitente isn't in a good position. Escribar's other recurring attack, which seems to appear at certain damage thresholds, is this huge beam of purple light that will almost certainly spell death for Penitente if he isn't behind Crisanta, who suddenly appears to cover you. The reason I think she's able to block this attack is because of her cords. She mentioned at the chapel that the cords she wears as a member of the Anointed Legion keep her from being wounded. Ironically, these cords were blessed by Escribar himself, who now finds these blessed wraps being used against him in battle. Near the end of the battle, Escribar asks what this cold in his entrails is, as he feels himself dying against the guilty blade. Right around the time this happens, he will go nuts, setting himself in the middle of the screen and just absolutely spamming purple skull projectiles in a last-ditch effort to take out Penitente before dying. I also adopt this strategy and start whacking away to win the DPS race and come out on top. As Escribar dies, he acknowledges that his final task is done and says that he's going to sink into the clouds and shimmering lights in this land, along with all of those who loved him. I'm not sure if this is wishful thinking or not, but I'm inclined to think that Escribar's death is an absolute one. Penitente doesn't have strong feelings about any of this though, and gives Escribar an absolutely gnarly execution, cutting off his tummy arm and then bisecting him. It's brutal, I love it. Although I don't love this fight, Escribar has been an awesome antagonist, and he received a fitting end. With his holiness out of the way, Crisanta urges us forward toward the final truth and outrage.
Delante os espera la última de las verdades, el último ultraje. Avanzad ahora por los mantos bordados hacia la luz.
Penitente is finally face to face with the High Wills, the architects behind the acts of the grievous miracle. And like any good big bad, they have a little monologue here at the end, and we are going to absolutely dine on it. First, they admonish Penitente for bringing guilt to the most sacred of places and for desecrating his holiness himself. In other words, they're mad that we brought the mea culpa to this place and killed their sentinel with it. And then they hit us with their credentials, stating that they are the High Wills who command the miracle, and that there is no miracle that does not stem from their desire. And yet, that's not true, not really. They kinda seem to change the topic here, asking Penitente, does not the pale, still light of this vast horizon hurt your eyes? I asked to keep this in mind with how Escribar also mentioned this blinding gray light of the procession, and this is why. It's not explicitly stated, but the implication is that Escribar and the High Wills are blinded by the light, but Penitente is not. And I think the difference here is that perhaps counterintuitively, Penitente and Crisanta's eyes have been opened to the truth by the holy wound of abnegation, and I think this is supported by what they say after asking this question. The High Wills call this procession a brotherhood of grieving souls, held captive by their own condemnation and benediction. This statement stands in opposition to the line from the lore of the holy wound of abnegation that states that the wound makes the soul suffer in a way that goes beyond repentance as an act and beyond guilt as a perpetual state. Everyone else here is caught in this cycle of condemnation and benediction, including Escribar and the High Wills, and this system, a system of their own making, blinds them. Also in this paragraph, the High Wills explain that the procession is more ancient than them, and that the kingdom was created by the miracle from the threads of dreams as a domain where faith would unite in one single, uninterrupted act of adoration. These are some clutch lines as they explicitly state that this kingdom made by the miracle precedes the High Wills. The miracle is more ancient than they are, and by creating this kingdom from the threads of dreams, gives evidence that not all acts of the miracle come from their will. Not technically, at least. And the reason I'm a little wishy-washy on this point is that I don't think the High Wills are lying or trying to be deceptive, rather that their true nature is part of the source of this kingdom, the collective dreams and faith of the custodians. Or to put my theory more bluntly, the High Wills are another manifestation of the miracle, made up of the collective will of the custodians, sort of a tulpa formed from their collective beliefs. Going way back to the beginning of the game, we were told that the miracle manifests the pains of the souls in the lands of Custodia. The miracle does not make on its own, it relies on the will of others. This kingdom is the collective faith of the custodians, and I think in a similar vein, the High Wills are the collective will of the custodians made flesh and sanctified. If you will indulge a little speculation, I think that as religion in Custodia developed, it became more organized and codified, and the High Wills became a manifestation of the orthodoxy of their religion, a tulpa created from the strength of their beliefs. And as belief in this orthodoxy increased and the authority of the church increased, the power of the High Wills reflected that and manifested that as true. As the High Wheels stated, the custodians are held captive by their own condemnation and benediction, because that is the belief system that was formed and reinforced by the church. This is why, for example, when the church forbids rosaries that are not made by Ingracia because only hers are truly blessed, it became true. Not because it necessarily was true, but because the church making it law made the custodians believe it to be true. And I'd like to be clear that my assertion that the High Wills are a manifestation of the collective will of Custodia, gone awry, is speculation based on what seems to make the most sense and in line with the themes of the game. There are other reads of the High Wills that paint them as more intentionally malevolent, such as the Gnostic demiurge type figure that is a false god that tries to trick and trap humans for its own gain. Those interpretations have merit, but I think that the High Wills as this embodiment of orthodoxy that is desperate to cling to power and inspire faith through fear and punishment is in line with the world and events of Custodia as this fantastical version of Inquisition-era Spain. This also loops back and roots everything in humanism that feels in line with how the miracle as this supernatural entity only responds to human desires. Blasphemous spends a lot of its time exploring the nature of man to commit shocking acts of evil and abuses of power, as well as commit acts of beauty and selflessness. Exploring this breadth of humanity is ultimately how the Game Kitchen reconciles the atrocities in art that are all part of the culture and history of Andalusia in a way that does not shy away from the ugliness or the beauty of their culture and feels very earnest to me. Finally, the High Wills, sensing their impending doom, make their final threats. They warn that the miracle will be bereft without their command, and as their final command, they order Penitentes' eternal condemnation for committing this ultimate blasphemy. Penitente and Crisanta are not swayed, however, and we get this awesome and grotesque cutscene of the High Wills getting eviscerated by the guilty and wrapped blades that ends in the High Wills blowing up in the sky. It is so sick. After this, we get another beautifully rendered cutscene where Penitente meets the Twisted One himself, who touches Penitente's helmet affectionately and then fades away. Tragically, mea culpa, its task complete, also crumbles back to the statue of the father that comprised its hilt. We then get a scene of Crisanta carrying a deceased Penitente and Deogracias kind of helping by holding on to one of Penitente's feet. Penitente was brought back by an act of the miracle to make his pilgrimage, and now that the High Wills are gone and the miracle is no longer being commanded, the power of this act fades, resulting in Penitente's death. The final scene shows the lid of his sepulcher closing, his task complete. And that's the final credits on Blasphemous. Holy moly. We get a little sneak peek after the credits of Blasphemous 2, but that's for another video. And that's Blasphemous. What an incredible game. And what an incredible journey this has been. It has been an absolute joy pulling the game apart, taking in the visuals, enjoying the music, and exploring the incredibly intricate Spanish history that's woven into Blasphemous and how it just saturates the storytelling and the atmosphere. I just love it. And it's been great pulling the parts of Blasphemous apart that don't work as well for me. Like, an easy one is the platforming is mediocre in Blasphemous, but it's so interesting how that intersects with this expectation of it being a Metroidvania, even if it isn't at its core, how that sense of platforming combined with not having the sort of trope platforming Metroidvania abilities is a turnoff for some people, and I understand that, but it's also interesting to see how underneath that, Blasphemous is still such a good game for player freedom and player choice with the non-linearity and the exploration. It still works so well even without those tropes. And it's not a discussion for here, but the Blasphemous sequel, Blasphemous 2, came out while I was making this video, and seeing what Blasphemous 2 does differently from Blasphemous 1, I think really shows the strengths of different approaches, and how I think it shows that Blasphemous 1 stands up really well for what it does in a way that's a bit different from what you may expect coming in if you believe it to be a Metroidvania or a Souls-like, and how it's sort of its own thing, but that it is consistent, and then I think it really works for what the Game Kitchen set out to do. And it was such a joy also exploring the development history of Blasphemous with all of you, and just telling the story about the Game Kitchen's struggles, like many in the games industry, to make their mark and to sort of throw a Hail Mary that is Blasphemous and have it land and just see the studio flourish. I want to throw out a thanks to them, not only just for being wonderful people, but because it's so nice as someone interested in games and how they're made, to have a studio like the Game Kitchen document it with landing Blasphemous, and to make art books, and to see them continuing that with Blasphemous 2, how they have dev diaries, and how they have an art book for Blasphemous 2 as well that really lets you get into the process. It's just great for fans of games, especially a game that you love like I have so much affection for Blasphemous. I hope you enjoyed this video. I really enjoyed making it, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, and I've had it pop up periodically, but please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Let me know what you enjoyed, and let me know your favorite parts about Blasphemous. Let me know your opinions about Blasphemous as well. I would love to hear them, and I'm hoping everyone enjoyed getting my thoughts on every detail of Blasphemous over the last few hours. Sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, thanks for watching.